Good morning and welcome to the second day of Objects in Motion. I'm Charlene Villaseñor Black and I'm Associate Professor in the Department of Art History at UCLA, and I'm thrilled to be able to introduce our session today. Our first speaker is Professor Gauvin Alexander Bailey, who is Professor and Bader Chair in Southern Baroque Art at Queen's University in Kingston, Canada. And I'm sure most of us here know his work. His two most recent books of a list of very many, Baroque and Rococo was issued by Faden in 2012. The Andean Hybrid Baroque, which I think most of us have been reading lately, came out in 2010. He's also the author of one of the major surveys on colonial Latin American art, colonial Latin America from 2005, and then of course, Art on the Jesuit Missions in Asia and Latin America in 1999. And this is just a selection of his books that I'm discussing this morning. He has most recently held the Guggenheim Fellowship in 2010, 2011. His paper this morning is entitled From the Rue Saint-Jacques to the Paraguayan Outback, The Itinerant Lives of Rococo Decorative Prints in 18th Century South America. And it's from the book that he's, I think, just finished or just submitted, The Spiritual Rococo, Decor and Divinity from the Salons of Paris to the Missions of Patagonia. So please help me welcome Professor Bailey this morning.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the people who organized the conference, Danielle and Meredith, for all of their help, and for the Getty for the organizational skills that they have shown. I wonder if you could just lower the lights so we can see the images when we get actual pictures. Thank you. No kind of object, and let's get that object up there. No kind of object has played such a decisive role in the diffusion of European styles to its colonies in Asia and Latin America as the print. Although sculptures and paintings accompanied conquistadors, sailors, and friars from European ports to places like New Spain, Macau, or Nouvelle-France, these media could not compete with engravings and illustrated books in price or availability. When Iberian powers began their expansions into Asia and the Americas in 1492 and 1498 respectively, printmaking was still a relatively new technology. Yet woodcuts and engravings were being adapted to paintings, featherwork, sculptural reliefs, and even architectural projects from the first decades of conquest. Prints also arrived with missionaries and merchants to non-European powers, such as Mughal India or Ming China, where artists used them to learn European conventions, whether out of curiosity, or, as in the case of carved ivories from 16th and 17th century Fujian, to gain a market edge in international trade with Portuguese and Spanish merchants. In Spanish and Portuguese America, artists most commonly turned to engravings from the prodigious Catholic presses of Antwerp, particularly in the large-scale painting cycles executed for the cloisters and churches of monastic foundations. Although artists frequently combined more than one print, they tended to limit the number of models or alterations they made, which were generally in costume and landscape elements, the addition of a few birds and trees, localizing the cityscapes, and of course in color, since these were generally not hand-painted. And this is a very good example of two prints from a very famous devotional book by Hermann Hugo about the longing of a soul for union with God. The Pia Desideria, it's called, being merged into one lunette in a cloister, a very famous cloister in a nunnery, a former nunnery, actually still a nunnery, in the southern Peruvian town of Arequipa. But things changed dramatically in the last third of the 18th century with the arrival of the Rococo ornamental engraving, a new breed of print that defied close copying, an often abstract model that deliberately encouraged artists to transform and dissect it, and to create collages so complex that they frequently cannot be traced to their sources. With an emphasis on decor over iconography, they elicited a kind of freedom of adaptation, far removed even from the Renaissance grotesque and arabesque patterns that were their closest equivalent in earlier Latin American decor. Such as this pulpit at the Church of San Francisco in Buenos Aires. It is based on a series of cartouches by Alexis Peyrotte from 1742, showing sea creatures and Asian motifs, chinoiserie, its bulbous contours enmeshed by a gilded tangle of leafy, fin-like fronds and sheaves of grass in one of the most free-form examples of Rococo decor in Latin America. Rococo ornamental engravings, published in the thousands in the presses of the Rue Saint-Jacques in Paris and the imperial city of Augsburg in Germany, flooded the art workshops of Latin America, particularly in Brazil and in parts of Spanish South America, where they allowed for a vigorous regional variation on the international Rococo that still remained close in spirit to the European models. On the right are two details of boiserie, or woodwork panels, from the Hôtel de Soubise in Paris from 1737, the quintessential Rococo space, the salon. And on the left, Rococo motifs from the 1780s in the churches of La Merced and El Pilar in Buenos Aires. Rococo prints did not merely usher in a new style, but actually revolutionized the way people used prints. Rococo decor would have been nothing but a footnote in the history of French domestic architecture had it not been for the engravings of domestic interiors, pulpits, altars, confessionals, trophies, fountains, chinoiserie, fantasy cartouches, and rocailles, or rockwork motifs, published over 3 decades by the printers of the Rue Saint-Jacques neighborhood and distributed worldwide. No other style to date had produced such a prodigious amount of ornamental prints. As Ebba Krul puts it, were nothing to survive of the Rococo other than its printed models, one would still have an almost complete overview of the style. The work of over 75 printmakers, painters, sculptors, goldsmiths, and architects, from the famous Boucher to the obscure Jean-Dominique Etienne Le Canu, the corpus of engravings from the Rue Saint-Jacques has left us with a bewildering quantity and variety of patterns. I personally have photographed almost 5,000 Rococo ornamental prints in collections in France, Germany, Austria, and the Czech Republic, and even taking into account that a few of them are reeditions and duplicates, the number is, to say the least, overwhelming. The imperial free city of Augsburg was the chief producer of Rococo ornamental prints outside Paris, and in fact outstripped the production of the Rue Saint-Jacques. Printers began by reissuing French motifs, but soon developed their own very distinct, more vigorous style called the Augsburger Geschmack, or Augsburg taste. Augsburg engravings were almost exclusively produced in undated folios of 4 or 5 sheets, and were aimed primarily at craftsmen, as indicated in some of the frontispiece titles. For example, Jakob Baumgartner called his book of rocaille designs "totally new drawing book, fitted out completely according to the latest style for good beginners." And Johann Rump's book of cartouches was named "newly invented and very useful cartouches according to the latest fashion." These titles tend to be rather upbeat. The folios were usually numbered, although by no means consecutively. Craftsmen or ateliers usually pasted them into working albums according to individual needs, also individual budgets, gathering together the work of single artists or of types of design, sometimes cutting them out of the sheet and pasting them together with others into a kind of collage or pastiche, or using a single motif, more or less doing freehand variations on a theme. Eventually, motifs became part of a standard repertoire of an atelier, and artists stopped looking at the originals. Augsburg also produced many more prints of church furnishings than did France, where Rococo was rarely used in church interiors, and as you probably all know, it was a very big style in Central European churches. And these were the most common prototype used also for South American altarpieces and pulpits. Although they were never reproduced exactly. We don't get slavish reproductions, we get inspiration. The retablo here of the Virgin of the Snows in the Church of San Ignacio in Buenos Aires, attributed to the sculptor Josef Schmidt, is based on this altarpiece model by Augsburg printmaker Franz Xaver Habermann, which has the Gloria with its sunburst, the urns, the same contour of the cornice and niche profile, and the light Rococo scrolls in the paneling. Schmidt added a second pair of columns, and he also simplified the design in order to make it harmonize with other altarpieces in the church. A more elaborate yet free-form adaptation of a similar model is the high altar at the Guarani parish church of Jaguaron in Paraguay by the itinerant Portuguese retablo maker José de Sousa Cavadas. The altarpiece combines an Augsburg-inspired pediment with a more Baroque lower section, dominated by Solomonic columns, a deep central niche with receding stage flats, a pyramidal staircase under the statue, and hood niches in the wings, ingeniously up at the top, flanking the central section there, and right over those two angels, he's added two more hood niches that kind of teeter on the edge. Its pediment is relatively faithful to its Germanic model, also by Franz Xaver Habermann, but Cavadas has transformed the scrolls flanking the central panel into these delightful, gently curving pilasters that look as if they were made of wax. Itinerant artists would have been particularly reliant upon scrapbooks of this kind of image, which they would adapt at each location according to the project, according to the dedication of the church. And Cavadas used his same scrapbook as far away as Brazil and Buenos Aires, where there are surviving works by him. The thing that separates most Rococo ornamental prints from more traditional models is that the motifs and decorative schemes were usually not intended for any single kind of interior or even medium. And few of the motifs derived from existing buildings or objects. Readers were even encouraged to dissect them, whether literally during a fad in the 1720s and 1730s for cutting them out with scissors and pasting them in albums, or, as in the circa 1730 new book of the Principles of Ornament after designs by Claude Guillot, by distorting them with a mirror that was sold with the book. Indeed, many Rococo ornamental engravings were not meant to be used at all, but rather to be admired as works of artifice by collectors, the same people who paid dearly for natural curiosities such as misshapen shells or pearls, or to serve as inspirations for designers' flights of fancy. Rococo patterns enjoyed the warm international reception precisely because their seemingly endless permutations and metamorphoses discouraged slavish imitation. Unfortunately, especially given that this conference is about objects and motions and we're trying to look at the careers of individual objects, so to speak, only a handful of the hundreds of Rococo ornamental prints that must have reached South America survives today. In fact, only in a single collection of French engravings in Rio de Janeiro. This collection includes work by Boucher, by Antoine Watteau, by Christophe Huet, and by several other figural as well as ornamental French artists of the early Rococo. They include books of cartouches, vases, trophies, and chinoiseries, and these are two examples of prints that are owned by the collection of Boucher from editions. They're from books called the Books of Cartouches and the Book of Chinese Figures, published in Paris by Gabriel Huquier. Other evidence is provided by archival sources. The Austrian retablo maker Conrad Kohl, the chief carpenter at the San Ignacio Church and College in Buenos Aires before 1767, when the Jesuits were kicked out of all of Spanish territories, had a workshop at the nearby Estancia in Areco, which contained a box of what was called, what a 1770s inventory calls, a large book of architectural prints and a box of various tidbits of prints, but frustratingly, these tidbits are not identified. More detail is provided by an inventory of figural engravings owned by the Brazilian painter Caetano Luiz de Miranda. This lists several series of prints which, judging by the work he executed, a surviving work of his, in the churches of the mining town of Diamantina, and from a manuscript he illustrated for a Third Order Brotherhood of St. Francis in 1776, were likely engravings like this one by the Klauber brothers of Augsburg, one of the most commonly found kind of half-decorative, half-hagiographic image throughout Brazil. Klauber prints were sometimes reproduced quite closely, as in the ceiling in the Cathedral at Olinda, after a print of St. John the Baptist done in reverse, a common treatment of a printed source, since either the original engraving itself or an enlarged cartoon would have been pricked out with a needle and then dusted from the back onto another sheet for reproduction. But even here, the painter has chosen to add legs to the saint, and amusingly has one of the two wolves at the bottom chasing a lion who has run off with one of St. John's lambs. I still haven't worked that one out. But these models were more often treated very liberally, very freely. Especially their at times lavish Rococo borders, which designers used to create decorative patterns in lieu of pattern books. As in this ceiling attributed to Manuel de Sacramento from 1802 at the Third Order Carmelite Church in Mogi das Cruzes, now in the outskirts of Sao Paulo. The ceiling also tells us a lot about how these prints were used. The artist only had a limited number of engravings of saints, but made creative use of whatever he had at hand, substituting whenever necessary. The central medallion, showing the ecstasy of St. Teresa, is actually a modified St. Scholastica by Philip Andreas Kilian from 1735, and published by Martin Engelbrecht, one of the big presses in Augsburg. So, a Benedictine saint standing in for a Carmelite one with a quick change of habit. The single and paired saints in conversation, popes, bishops, monks, friars, and nuns, who emerge from the entablatures on both sides, are taken from various individual saints' images by Klauber and Kilian, often transformed from non-Carmelite saints into ones that fit the iconography. But the most interesting part is that even the ornament is made on the fly. It doesn't derive from purpose-made ornamental prints such as we've seen earlier, but instead builds its network of shellwork and rocailles from the borders found on engravings of saints, such as this mid-century print of St. Rupert by Philip Dana. Rupert appears among the bishops along the side of the ceiling, but again transformed into one of the church fathers, transformed as someone else, into one of the church fathers in this case. Another example of creative pastiching, and I don't think that's a word, shall we call it collaging, is the high altar at Buenos Aires Cathedral by Isidro Lorea, the designer of the San Francisco pulpit we looked at earlier on, and one of the pioneers of Rococo altarpieces in Buenos Aires. This altarpiece uses different French models to create a new kind of retablo for Latin America. Based loosely on Juste Alred Messonnier's high altar project for Saint-Sulpice in Paris, published in his Livre d'Ornement of 1734, the cathedral high altar is conceived as a baldachin in the round, so it actually was meant to stand under the crossing in the middle of the church, which is very unusual in Latin America, where retablos tend to be flat against the wall. And in fact, in the end, they did move it against the wall, but it was designed to go under the crossing. Wings of freestanding columns extend forward and backward diagonally from the central body of the altar, fanning out slightly at the extremities like pages in a book, creating deep concavities in the cornices and down below in the dado and plinth. Isidro Lorea does something even more revolutionary with the decoration of the altarpiece. Inspired by Rococo's privileging of decor over figural imagery, he reduces the number of saints or narrative panels and replaces them with decorative cartouches or trophy imagery with symbols relating to the dedication or patronage of the altar. The decoration comes from two other French sources: mid-century cartouche designs by Charles Edmé Babel. These are very, very popular in Buenos Aires and other altarpieces as well. And Marshall trophies from 1736 by René Jacques Le Charpentier. The way Laureat adapts the cartouche is especially interesting since it demonstrates the freedom with which artists were now adapting their models, combining different cartouches or using part of a single one, usually the crown as here, as a springboard for original designs. The most elaborate of his adaptations of Babel's cartouches is the decoration here of the high altar panel. This is the panel right in front of the altar, by the way, where the present Pope used to say Mass, which derives its crown and sides from one of Babel's cartouches, but does something entirely different with the lower section, which he also populates with site-specific symbolism. Palmette, a rose, a tiara, laurel branch, scepter, and spear. And he related these elements related it very specifically to the patronage of the altar, which was not just the bishopric, but also the viceroyalty. So that's why we have imagery related to rulership. No region embraced Rococo as enthusiastically as Brazil, where unlike in Spanish America, decor encompassed the whole interior of the church. Brazil was also unusual in that designers frequently used French domestic Rococo as their models, so that some church interiors looked like the insides of Paris salons. This love for profane Rococo in churches in Brazil may in part have been a product of their patronage. Brazilian church building was indebted to an unusual degree to lay religious organizations, such as confraternities, called irmandades, brotherhoods, or third-order brotherhoods. In some regions, this dominance of lay order patronage was the product of political realities. In the mining region of Minas Gerais, the crown forbade religious orders from establishing themselves in the region in 1711, probably wisely, for fear that they would control the gold trade. So the churches there were financed and built by these lay groups. In all regions, confraternities and other lay religious organizations established a communal identity through lavish gifts to local church construction and decoration. And their championing of the Rococo, a style deemed not only cutting edge, but also less associated with church hierarchy and, quite frankly, with France, was a logical step. In fact, the role of churches as a place for social display was reinforced by another law in 1759, which prohibited Brazilians from displaying wealth in their homes, carriages, or even clothing, but encouraged them to lavish their funds on church interiors. These confraternities also produced or promoted a culture of enlightenment intellectualism, again, particularly in Minas Gerais, where a flourishing middle class produced some of South America's greatest poets, writers, and thinkers, such as Claudio Manuel da Costa, a very famous Brazilian colonial-era poet, as well as members of Brazil's earliest independence movement in the 1780s. Some of these were actually the same people. And these people were also directly linked to the patronage of many of these churches. Lay religious groups in Minas Gerais were extremely wealthy, and the region was flooded with artists and craftsmen from Brazil and Europe, keen on cashing in on this artistic gold rush. Many, like Cavadas, who we saw in Paraguay, were itinerant, traveling from one town to the next and setting up shop in individual work sites. Or like Caetano Luis de Miranda, they would have brought their scrapbooks of Rococo engravings along with them, providing a certain stylistic harmony over often great distances. For example, people in Minas Gerais often worked down in what's now Sao Paulo State, so way in the south, way to the south of Minas Gerais. And this provided stylistic unity thanks to these engravings. The most famous sculptor of all, the Afro-Brazilian Antonio Francisco Lisboa, better known as Aleijadinho, had a wide selection of both French and German models in his kit, and was particularly free with his interpretations and adaptations and combinations of these sources. In his facade for the Third Order Franciscan Church of San Francisco in Ouro Preto, his most famous facade, begun 1766, carved from the malleable local soapstone, he merged at least 3 different Augsburg engravings to create a unique design that was iconographically suited to the site, but even more interestingly, that was suited to the architecture, the structure. The earliest part of the facade relief is the medallion of St. Francis receiving the stigmata, in which Rococo elements are limited to 4 shell cartouches attached to the otherwise plain circular frame. Aleijadinho has copied an engraving by Klauber, we don't know which Klauber, one of the Klaubers, from 1750-ish, everything's circa 1750, in reverse. However, selecting only the main figures of the kneeling St. Francis and the seraphic cross, which, by the way, he turns into this kind of caryatid figure. So he really cuts down what's in it to what is necessary. Then, more interestingly, he puts a church in the upper right-hand corner that is a very close rendition of what the architecture of Minas Gerais looks like. So a local-style church. Not of that exact church, but of the churches of the region. And he himself was an architect as well as a sculptor. The lower part of the facade relief is developed from 2 sources. The first, a small print, again in reverse, of the Virgin Immaculate, published by Klauber. Again, we don't know which one. Again, circa 1750. The Virgin has the same pose, and Aleijadinho has transformed the crown of stars into a real crown of bronze. The oval medallion is similarly overlaid with rose branches and lilies, and putti appear in the lower 2 corners as in the print, although Aleijadinho has reduced them to winged cherub heads. The crown of thorns, which serves in the print as a border for the inscription, is turned into a real crown of thorns. And then he adds the crossed arms, one of Jesus and one of St. Francis, that is the emblem of the Franciscan order. So again, adapting it to a very specific Franciscan context. He goes even further than that by changing the inscription in the banderole to one that relates very specifically to the Franciscan hero Duns Scotus, very important scholastic. And this is an antiphon that was favored by this early Franciscan. The extravagant irregular double shield, however, is not from a religious source. This comes here. He's turned the dual coat of arms into the Franciscan emblem of Christ's 5 wounds on the left and the Portuguese coat of arms on the right. But it comes from one of these many Augsburg prints of noblemen and members of the court with heraldic cartouches at the base. This is taken from one of a portrait of Prince Bishop Joseph Landgrave of Hesse-Darmstadt from 1740 to 60 by Gottfried Bernhard Goetz. In fact, I think it's close enough that this may be the actual one. Fascinatingly, the print has not just inspired the 2 coats of arms, but in fact the curvature of the lintel of the door. And therefore, a small holy card, as it were, in this case a secular holy card, has inspired the very form of architecture of this very famous facade. He's replaced the 2 heraldic lions with the risen Christ and an angel. The Ouro Preto Church and its rival, the Third Order Franciscan Church at São João del Rei, also in Minas Gerais, have 2 of the most sophisticated Rococo interiors in Brazil, especially the chancel, which in Brazilian churches, like those of Portugal, forms a separate hall called the Capela Mor. And I should say that in general, the Third Order Brotherhoods were building their churches in rivalry with each other, and so the second, São João del Rei, was in fact trying to outdo the São Francisco and Ouro Preto. Aleijadinho designed the chancel at São Francisco and Ouro Preto on the left, which was built between 1773 and 1794 by Henrique Gomes de Brito and others, while the vault design at São João del Rei begun 1781 on the right, although inspired by Aleijadinho's model, was supervised by a team under Luis Pinheiro. The 2 chancels stand out like stages, with dazzling white gilded wood carving on the altarpiece and an intertwining network of moldings and medallions in the ceiling. Yet they are striking for their delicacy rather than their opulence, with an almost dichromatic balance between the milky white walls, altarpiece, and vault, and the spider's web of gilded decor. Although there are splashes of color elsewhere, there's some false blue marbling in the altar, and there's some flesh tones in the saints' figures. But otherwise, it's very much a dichromatic, harmonious balance that's being aimed at. In both churches, the gilding unites the chancel from dado to vault in a harmonious web of rocailles and foliage. The chancel decor at these two churches is closer than any other in Latin America to the decorative scheme of the Salon de la Princesse at the Hôtel de Soubise. So close, in fact, that I am convinced that the rocaille arabesques in the vaults, and at least the very idea of them, which link the corners of the room with the top of the vaults, derived directly from Germain Boffrand's illustrations of that Parisian salon in his Livre d'Architecture in 1745. The landscapes at Rio Preto are more truncated, but those at Saint João del Rei on the left are very close to Boffrand's model, formed as segments of cartouches and foliage and meeting at the scallop boss at the center. No large sacred interior in Latin America is more consistently French than the spacious church of the Carmel de Antigua Sé, the former Carmelite church begun in 1761 and transformed in 1808 into the Chapel Royal and Cathedral when the Portuguese court moved to Rio de Janeiro to escape Napoleon. Constructed between 1785 and 95, the originally 9 altarpieces and the relief carving the nave and Capella Mor were the work of Ignacio Ferreira Pinto, one of the city's leading woodcarvers. Although the church was expanded upon its elevation to royal status, this did not affect anything in the nave or in the Capella Mor, only in the sides, which are not seen in this picture. They made deeper side chapels. The most remarkable feature of this interior is the use of off-white wood paneling with gilded frames and accents, providing a levity and brightness further heightened by the natural light which spills in from the chancel windows in the late morning. Although giant pilasters are used throughout the nave and the chancel, they're treated more like panels. They're flat against the wall. They're treated ornamentally, lined or framed with very delicate gilded frames. So it looks like a paneled interior rather than one with strict architectonic forms. The carving is very sophisticated. Rocailles appear throughout the interior, although and often irregular ones, although they're always balanced with another irregular one on the other side. There's extreme naturalism in the flowers and the sheaves of wheat that are in the interiors. One of the most characteristic forms is this kind of panel with the rocaille motif at the top and bottom, and then a circular sun-like motif in the central section. This arrangement recalls early French Rococo interiors and appears in several engravings and in designs by Charpentier and Jacques-François Blondel, and also appears in Jean Aubert's rooms at Chantilly, which is the one on the right, from 1722. In fact, the color scheme and even symmetrical treatment of gilded motifs, so the Carmel de Antigua Sé, makes the whole interior strikingly close to the decor at Chantilly. Paradoxically, therefore, one of the latest monuments of the global Rococo was executed in the early Regency style, 40 years after Rococo itself had been dismissed in France. Perhaps one of the reasons Rococo lasted so long in Brazil and parts of Spanish South America was that it became the preferred style of the enlightenment-minded bourgeoisie in the last decades of the colonial era and of the independence movement itself. In sharp contrast to France and Central Europe, where the Rococo was considered the enemy of reason, in parts of South America it became the preferred style of reformers because, paradoxically, its lightness and delicacy, precisely the aspects deemed decadent in Europe, brought a breath of fresh air to a style of ecclesiastical decor that was considered too complex and too overwrought. This is a detail from one of the fabulous side altars in the Church of El Pilar in Buenos Aires from 1771. Rococo's clarity of form, its light colors, its aura of optimism, provided a dramatic break from Baroque interiors, overwhelmed with bulky, profusely decorated and gilded carving. An aesthetic perhaps associated with some people's minds with the colonial church establishment. On the left is a Baroque altarpiece, very famous from the 1760s from the Jesuit novitiate church at Tepoztlán in New Spain, in Mexico. And on the right is the high altar of Santa Catalina, the Church of Santa Catalina in Buenos Aires, from a decade later. French and German printed models provided the tools for new decorative styles that encouraged a freedom of interpretation that appealed to these increasingly cosmopolitan patrons. Altarpiece models from Augsburg were chosen in Santiago and Buenos Aires not for their elaborateness, but because they allowed a return to clear structure, to columns, to formal unity, and a reduction of ornament, as here at the Alterpiece of St. Ignatius from the Church of San Miguel in Santiago, Chile, circa 1748 to 62, derived from a 1750s model by Franz Sauber Habermann. In these two cities, a hybrid Rococo neoclassical style of retablo were built well into the 19th century, decades after a quote-unquote purer neoclassicism prevailed elsewhere in Latin America and Europe, such as this retablo on the left, being recently restored at the Church of Santa Ana in Santiago, the first decade of the 19th century. It simplifies the lines of its model, yet preserves a hint of Rococo curvilinear scrolls on the side. Although the ornamental engravings that made all of this possible are long gone and can only be teased out by tracing the origins of individual motifs from extant church interiors, their legacy lives on and provides a revealing insight into the mechanics of stylistic transferal and transformation, and the way in which forms created for one context and one continent take on unexpectedly new lives far from their place of origin. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great paper. I kept thinking of comparisons to Mexico. But we'd like to open up questions. Please wait till the microphone comes to you.
Yeah, we had a bit of an adventure yesterday with that.
Hi, thank you. I was wondering if you could, well, I have two questions. And the first is that I was wondering if you've been able to trace how the prints from Augsburg in particular got to colonial Latin America, if you have any sense about how that happened. That's the first question.
That's a difficult one to answer. There are records of book sales, sometimes even printed records of book sales because they print the catalog in Buenos Aires in the 1770s, in Brazil also around the same time, that sometimes list books that say of architecture or something, but I have seen no reference to a book of engravings or to individual sheets coming to Latin America in any kind of source.
Okay.
This is the usual problem, right?
Yeah. And then the second question is, I take your point about how ornamental prints kind of lend themselves to a kind of free adaptation and interpretation at work in the churches. But I'm wondering if there's ever, or if you could point to an instance when you could point to a moment where adaptation was perhaps like less free, if you could say it that way, when there wasn't a point, or when was there a point when it was less so, would you say?
Well, I think it's a hard question to answer because it's partly to do with era and partly to do with style. The material from the 17th century and even the 16th century is much easier to match with engravings. I mean, everyone plays that game trying to link up images to actual engravings, and that's really not that hard for earlier periods. Suddenly, in the 18th century, the last third of the 18th century, it becomes virtually impossible. And so it's partly because these sources, these engravings, are so free-form that it's hard. Well, you could reproduce it exactly, but it seems to inspire them not to. The very closest I've ever found is something like that one I showed you of the Alterpiece in Buenos Aires, but even that, they chopped off the bottom part. He figured it out his own way. And then his later work at La Merced in the same city, he's doing crazy things with that same Babel cartouche without ever having looked at it again. So just from the very practical point of view of tracing the sources, it's very difficult. And this is not just Latin America. I mean, German scholars have, for decades, had very, very little luck tracing anything inside those magnificent icing cake Bavarian Rococo churches to any individual source.
Hi, I also have two questions. The first is a sort of methodological question related to what you were just talking about. Whoops, there goes my notebook. And this is something I struggle with in my own work, which is why I ask, how do you determine when you feel there's a confident match? Given that there is a kind of play and a free-form association.
If I could answer that question.
But
I
mean,
sorry, go ahead.
you are showing us matches, so, or what you think are points of inspiration. So how do you determine that operation exactly? When is it close enough?
Well, it's very rare, first of all. The ones I've shown you are sort of a handful of a lot of failures that, there's a lot of things I just can't link up. And after a certain point, it's not interesting anymore to try to link things up. But at what point do I decide it matched? I show my wife, I said, does this look right? She said, nah, go to the next one. That's basically, to be honest.
Okay.
Sorry, I don't mean to make light of it. It's just you use your eyes at some point, you feel, I think this will fly, you show it to a colleague.
Okay, that's fair enough. And then my second question is, the operation you're talking about in terms of kind of combinatory style, the way that the Rococo lends itself to addition and play, is an operation at work in Europe also, and for European craftsmen also.
Yes,
and
indeed.
So I'm wondering, you talk about a kind of semantic restructuring of the Rococo in Latin America, but on the level of production, how do you see the operation being different in Latin America? I mean, we are dealing with a fundamentally different cultural context, a different artistic landscape with different possibilities for artisans and artists, different levels of status they can attain. So how do you see the production as being different there?
The production part.
The production aspect.
I think it's more reliant on engravings than it is in Europe. So even though they are freer with them than they had been in the past, the production, say, of the Wesselbrunner in Germany is much freer and derived more from the actual making of stucco, and it lives its own life within stucco. Half this book's on Europe, by the way, so I have the first half is dealing with what happens in France and Germany and Portugal, and then the other. So in Germany, very, very quickly, in fact, there's a big argument about what came first, the print or the Wesselbrunner stucco makers, but I mean, at some point, there's no reliance at all on prints anymore. Yet they go and they print them. They go and design, like stucco makers, like Feichmeier, design prints that are published in Augsburg. But the big difference is that they don't use them very much in Germany in the way they do in South America. So if you want to compare it, it is closer to the models. It's much harder to find a German match by far than it is in South America. Even confessionals and altarpieces where you'd expect to find, you match up a Habermann with what you're looking at, it very rarely happens. Like there's some confessionals in the Theatinerkirche in Munich that use 4 different models for the same confessional. Mm-hmm. So, did I answer your question?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Gauvin. If I could just follow up on the second part of that question. I mean, the core unit of an ornament print, a Rococo ornament print, is a raffle leaf. And the purpose of the raffle leaf is that it helps the artisan trace their hand along, and a part of it is the training of the hand of the artisan as well. So there is an element of training and production to the circulation of these prints, because they're supposed to be instructive. And so I wonder if you could just maybe tell us a little bit more about whether in this transmission from Europe to Latin America, whether there's a similar emphasis on training the hand of the artisan as well, because I mean, I'm trying to follow what you're suggesting about this correspondence between the visual forms of these prints and the realized architectural designs, because a big part of the circulation of these prints isn't so much just to have an exact copy of the print, but to create almost a kind of proto-modular design. So I'm just trying to get at, what is happening with the way that artisans are engaging with these prints within this new context.
Well, I wish I could answer that one too. There's very little evidence of exactly what happened. We know people owned them. A few drawings survive after prints that give us some information, but not very many. It's really just the final product that lets us know how far artists have gone from the original and sort of how far they stretch it. So in terms of how they're trained, how their approach to an engraving changes, that's the evidence, unfortunately. Yeah.
One more question right here.
Thank you so much for that really wonderful talk. And this may be another question that you aren't able to answer, but it's kind of a follow-up point to Jessica's question about adaptability. And one of the ideas about the Rococo, one of the sort of understandings, or I would say misunderstandings, for why it's so adaptable is that there's no sophisticated body of theory attached to it. And as we know, and as I'm sure you know that that's just not true. I mean, Beaufrant's Livre d'Architecture provides a kind of theoretical language for understanding Rococo prints and their function, and they're connected in some ways to empiricist notions of kind of knowledge being mobilized through the senses, and there's been a lot of work. Yes, and there's been a lot of work done on how that was translated in terms of Rococo church interiors in Germany, and I'm just wondering.
Christian Hertel and people like that. Yeah.
Exactly. So I'm just wondering whether you have found any information about these lay confraternities that you mentioned. How aware might they be of these kinds of philosophical notions that are emerging in France or in Europe around this time? And could they possibly be mobilizing these Rococo prints to suggest ideas that are related to, I don't know, changing notions of religious philosophy or whatever it is that they're actually trying to say through this visual language?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because half of my book is in fact about also the spread of books, about the spread in particular of French religious books, preaching, but also treatises of what I call the spiritual Rococo, this movement in the early 18th century of kind of Christianity light that was being promoted in Paris, but also of Enlightenment writers. And so I've done I've looked at lots of archives of 18th century libraries in South America, and the few ones that still exist I visited. And there's a tremendous increase of interest in French Enlightenment and also French spirituality of the 18th century within a few decades in places like Minas Gerais, in fact everywhere, Buenos Aires, Santiago. Can I make a link between a sort of literary / ideological attitude and a style? I'm not sure I can. But I'd like to throw that out. And I think it will always remain speculative, but we do have to think of new ways of answering questions we can't answer with documents, as we heard yesterday. So that's...
All right, thank you very much. Let's continue the conversation a little more informally, but let's thank Professor Bailey.
Thank you.
It's my pleasure to introduce our second speaker this morning, Dr. Zirwat Chowdhury. She received her PhD from Northwestern in 2012. She's currently an Amundsen Getty postdoctoral fellow at UCLA at our Center for 17th and 18th Century Studies and the William Andrews Clark Memorial Library. And last year we were together at the Huntington Library, where she was a Mellon Fellow there. Her dissertation is entitled Imperceptible Transitions, the Anglo-Indianization of British Architecture, 1769 to 1822. And her paper this morning is Monumentality in Motion, a Mughal Audience Tent in Late 18th Century Jodhpur. And let's welcome her this morning.
Thank you for the introduction, Charlene, and thank you to the conference organizers for this invitation to speak at this weekend's conference. I am going to step away from 18th century Britain and at least British India today and talk a little bit more about broader questions of the transmission of Mughalness in 18th century North India. So, on that note, Mughal palaces, forts, and tombs, both royal and saintly, celebrated the divinely and celestially sanctioned powers of the emperor, with their scale, material, and ornamental exuberance and historicist bent. And I give you here Humayun's tomb in Delhi and the Buland Darwaza, which is at Fatehpur Sikri, the palatial city complex built by Akbar, the Emperor Akbar. In the cities of Delhi, oh wait, actually I can just use this. In the cities of Delhi, Agra, Fatehpur Sikri, and Lahore, large-scale palaces, forts, and tombs made Mughal power visible from far and away and announced the dynasty's durability and finesse in red sandstone and marble, and with the fine craftsmanship and immense labor of their construction. The time expended on such projects, in turn, attested both to the emperor's control over the resources of his empire and the stability of his regime. Finally, as historian Asfar Moin has recently shown, through the repetition of Timurid origin myths, and these pertain primarily to supernatural birth myths for all the Mughal emperors. And rituals, Mughal kingship was endowed with sacred and transmigratory powers. And Mughal emperors thus proclaimed themselves in competition with the Safavids, heirs to Tamerlane. And I think Alka brought this up a little bit in some of her questions yesterday. Indeed, during the reign of the Emperor Shah Jahan, as Ebba Koch has masterfully shown, imperial power, especially as enacted through courtly ritual, was plotted into the spatial organization and design of Mughal architecture itself, notably in the centering of the Charoka window from which the emperor would hold audience in the Diwan-e-Am. And yet the Mughal court was rarely fixed. Not only did the dynasty have nomadic roots, triggered primarily by the instabilities in rule in the case of its founder, Babur, and his son and successor, Humayun, but climate, war, and pilgrimage necessitated that the Mughal emperor also be a frequent traveler. As Carla Sinopoli has shown, Mughal capitals, and just to highlight, there's Delhi, Ajmer, Agra and Lahore right there. Mughal capitals often functioned in multiples. Thus, even while the empire had achieved the contours of an increasingly centralized bureaucracy from the reign of Emperor Akbar onwards, and even after its capital was primarily sited in Delhi from the 17th century onwards during the reign of Shah Jahan, such centralization did not serve to fix the Mughal emperor in one place. Instead, it necessitated that the monumentality with which the Mughal court and state announced its escalating power itself be put in motion. Mughal chronicles and gazettes such as the Aini-Akbari, which I'm very grateful that Chanchal already spoke of that a little bit yesterday, and European travel accounts all highlight the imperial tent that traveled in duplicate as one of the most important instances of Mughal monumentality in motion. And you must excuse me for one of the slides that I'm going to show you a little bit later because it's one of the only few images I could find of this tent that I'll talk about today. Indeed, one can argue that the Aini-Akbari pays greater attention to Mughal tents than it does to Mughal buildings. My paper today will focus on a solitary Shahjahani tent called the Lal Dera, and this is a popular name of this tent, that was looted by the Rathore Maharaja of Jodhpur, Jaswant Singh, and taken to his palace fort, Mehrangarh. And just to give you a sense, Jodhpur is right here. And this is where the tent remains to this day. Whereas the tent's installation in Jodhpur is often celebrated as a symbol of the Rathore defiance of the Mughals. This was even the rhetoric behind the tent's display at the Metropolitan Museum of Art show, India, in 1985, not 1785. I will contend instead that secured as an errant twin, and I'll speak about this more, and eventually as a solitary object in Jodhpur, the tent's mobile character instantiated the challenges faced by Mughal and Rathore kingship on the heels of the Mughal Empire's fragmentation in the 18th century. And I should add that the fact that this tent is one half of what I think is a twin pair is almost never mentioned in accounts of it. In this vein, the first part of my paper will argue that the manner in which Mughal monumentality was put into motion from the 16th century onwards, that is, via duplication, drew attention to the centrifugal forces that constantly threatened to undo Mughal sovereignty. In the second part of my paper, I will demonstrate why the tent was made immobile and affixed at Mehrangarh in an effort to combat the fraught nature of 18th century Jodhpuri royal sovereignty. The Lal Dera, which it's a pretty big tent, it measures about 12 feet and 8 inches by 24 feet and 9 inches and 4 feet and 6 inches, so you can see it's pretty big space here, was most likely a product of the imperial workshop in Ahmedabad. It is made of embroidered silk velvet, and I'll give you some details here, with metal-wrapped yarns and cotton. Yellow flowers embroidered on the silk velvet, outlined with golden thread, and bordered with blue silk brighten its interiors. The tent's red color scheme designates its use by the emperor, and its lobed archways and floral ornament establish its continuity with the architectural lexicon of audience halls constructed during the reign of Shah Jahan. And this is again the Charoka window, the Charoka throne from the Diwan-e-Am in Delhi. An enclosure within the tent is separated from the throne or gaddi and repeats the mise en abîme effect of the dais for the throne in the Diwan-e-Am. Before I say more about the tent and its setting in Jodhpur, let me first explain the duplicate function of the tent. Mughal chroniclers such as Abul Fazl and Chandrabhan Brahman, and European diplomats and travelers such as Sir Thomas Roe, François Bernier, and Peter Mundy all devote considerable praise to the achievements of the Farashkhane, or tent workshop, for the ingenuity and might with which it enabled the Mughal court to move. With mechanical strength, horse or elephant power, and labor, the Farashkhane set up grand ephemeral camps that observed the hierarchy of the Mughal court and celebrated its material splendor. And just to give you a sense, so this is supposed to be a plan that's based on Abul Fazl's description of the imperial camp. And originally, this is the imperial harem where the emperor would also reside while he was in camp. And this was the original hall of public audience. And scholars surmise that during the reign of Shah Jahan, it is this area that becomes the hall of public audience in camp. An enclosure with scholars have devoted considerable attention to the specialized nomenclature of Mughal tents. While the proliferation of terms used to denote tent, the doashiana manzil, which basically means a two-story tent, the gulalbar, the zamindos, and the ajaibi, suggests a correspondence between form and function, or form and courtly hierarchy. Peter Andrews' formidable study of nomadic tents also attests to the fluidity of these terms. So even though there's this proliferation of terms, it's actually very hard to match these terms with actual tents. One feature of the camp, especially of the imperial tent, that caught the attention of its commentators was not the mere efficiency or sheer labor with which extravagant camps were set up, but rather the simultaneity with which a second camp, the Peshkhania Sadat Nishan, would be installed while a first was dismantled. In other words, once the court was set into motion, the tandem setup of the camps at two different sites would counter the dissolution of the imperial camp at one site with the anticipation of its materialization at the next. While the comforts of the Mughal emperor were among the key concerns behind the Peshkhania Sadat Nishan, the twin tents would have also highlighted the spectral sovereignty that belied Mughal kingship. Marred with external threats and internal conflict, Mughal successions were rarely seamless. In two intriguing essays co-authored with Jorge Flores and Muzaffar Alam, respectively, Sanjay Subramaniam has demonstrated how a proliferation of impostors and pretenders in the 17th and 18th century Mughal Empire complicate the picture of a centralized and singularized sovereignty, and point instead to the continuing importance of shared sovereignty to the Mughals. Not only was every Mughal succession accompanied by conflict between fathers and sons, or between brothers and cousins, or amongst brothers, but also the numerous contenders to the throne, however inutile their efforts may have been, could assert their claims with more than just military power. Indeed, sovereign power was ascertained through the contenders' understanding of courtly etiquette, their literary or philological prowess, and their ability to discern and interpret wondrous phenomenon. Whereas Mughal successions would become especially fraught following the reign of Shah Jahan, with violent conflict between his sons Dara Shikoh, Aurangzeb, Murad, and Shah Shuja, the absence of primogeniture would spiral the Mughal throne into absolute chaos upon the death in 1707 of Aurangzeb. Indeed, the Mughal throne would be seated with 7 different kings in the first 2 decades after the death of Aurangzeb. It was during this era of Mughal decline that the Lal Dera is most likely to have found its new home in Jodhpur, but without its twin. But first, how did the Mughal tent arrive in Jodhpur? For this purpose, and this is Mehrangarh Fort on the right where the tent is currently housed. For this purpose, let me begin by charting out the relationship between Marwar and the Mughal Empire from the reign of Emperor Akbar onwards. Rathore clansmen from Kannauj in North India settled Marwar in the 13th century, and the relationship of the Rathore Raja to his fellow clansmen hinged on that of Bhaiband, or brotherhood, Bhai literally meaning brother, with the Raja serving as a first among equals. Scholars largely agree that Marwar's inclusion within Mughal domains during the reign of Akbar marks the onset of patrilineal rule, albeit without the law of primogeniture. Just as the Maharaja had become a mansabdar of the Mughal emperor, in other words, he now entered into the service of the Mughal emperor by being initiated into the Mughal military elite, so too did Rathore clansmen become clients of the Maharaja. So basically, it is only with the onset of Mughal rule that you see this consolidation of Rathore power. It was within this network of Mughal clientship and on the heels of its dissolution that the transfer of the Lal Dera took place. As the story has been popularly told and retold, and as I pointed out earlier, even before the death of Shah Jahan, the emperor's sons, and I give you a painting of Shah Jahan with his 3 sons, had entered into conflict over the succession of the Mughal throne. And I am being somewhat manipulative and showing you a lot of miniatures of Mughal emperors standing under tents. Prince Aurangzeb had set forth to quell the opposition of his brothers, in particular Shah Shuja and Dara Sukho, by mobilizing against them the various tributary rulers beholden to the Mughals. Among them was the Rathore Maharaja of Jodhpur, Jaswant Singh. Having defended the Mughal standard as family and mansabdar during the reign of Shah Jahan, and Shah Jahan's mother is a Jodhpuri princess, Jaswant Singh's loyalties first lay with Dara Sukho, the emperor's chosen successor, and did not easily shift to a rebel prince Aurangzeb. Hoping to weaken the imperial forces, Jaswant Singh sprung a surprise attack against Aurangzeb at the Battle of Kajwa in 1658, and this is seen as a big betrayal because he was actually fighting for Aurangzeb at this battle. Although the imperial forces prevailed in the end, Jaswant Singh made away with loot from the imperial camp that most likely included the Lal Dera. In the events that followed, Jaswant Singh invited Dara Sukho, one of the other contenders, in fact, the original successor to Shah Jahan, to Jodhpur, but rescinded his offer once he learned that Aurangzeb was personally leading Mughal troops to Jodhpur. The expediency with which both Aurangzeb and Dara Sukho marched towards Jodhpur, where the tent was most likely housed, underscores how a non-imperial city like Jodhpur had become a crucial site from which rival claims would be laid to the Mughal throne, albeit by circulating or errant Mughal princes. Such challenges would become especially salient in the 18th century when disruptions within Mughal successions became especially rampant. Thus, for example, following the Rohilla leader Ghulam Qadir's violent invasion of Delhi in 1789, not only would the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam be blinded and temporarily deposed, but, as recounted by Subramaniam and Alam, the attacks would also enable a Mughal prince named Mirza Ali Bakht Asfari to escape and make a failed attempt to gather troops in Jodhpur. Rathore kings also faced similar pressures to extract their crown from more enduring notions of shared sovereignty in the 18th century. As I will now explain, within the sovereign terrain of 18th century Jodhpur, the tense isolation from its twin and its storage in Mehrangarh would translate it into the domain of nominalism, thereby enabling it to inoculate the Rathore crown against the forms of circulation that had also become crucial to its survival from the mid-18th century onwards. Upon the death of Jaswant Singh, Aurangzeb refused to acknowledge the Maharaja's newborn son, Ajit Singh, as the rightful heir. By suppressing the opposition of Rathore clansmen to his decision, Aurangzeb installed his own choice of heir. It was only upon the death of the Mughal emperor in 1707 that Ajit Singh would finally be seated on the Rathore throne. His rebuilding efforts at Mehrangarh, which was severely damaged during a recent Mughal siege, on the one hand extended a Shahjahani imperial architectural lexicon to Jodhpur, with the use, for example, of the baluster columns, which you see here, and the painted, the paintings on the interior of the Phul Mahal are all from the 19th century, but the structures are 18th century. On the other, as Giles Tillotson has pointed out, they also introduced new non-Mughal forms, such as the scroll-like capital with banding below. So this capital, so these really kind of separate the 18th century reconstructions or renovations within Mehrangarh from the rest of the palace complex because they're seen very much as a kind of the mark of Ajit Singh. However, Ajit Singh's reign and those of his two immediate successors would be cut short by similar instabilities as those that the Mughal court itself was undergoing during this period. That is, by claims from rival princes and opposition from the increasingly powerful Marathas. And I just give you the line of succession just so you can see. It's basically all within the same family. And Abhay Singh, which I'll tell you more about shortly, Abhay Singh is the son of Ajit Singh, who incidentally also murders him. So it's pretty violent, brothers and fathers, and everybody's just fighting. Let's see. Such as those from the Mughal court itself was undergoing during this period, that is by claims from rival princes and opposition from the increasingly powerful Marathas, who are the ascendant power in India in the 18th century, and they're from the Deccan. Whereas Ajit Singh made concerted efforts to negotiate his power within the Mughal court, the Mughal emperor Muhammad Shah's dominance over the Rathore throne ultimately prevailed. When Ajit Singh's son, Abhay Singh, plotted with his brother Bakht Singh, whom you have up there as well, and murdered his father, the Maharaja personally crowned the prince as the new monarch. And historians agree mostly that Abhay Singh had in all likelihood plotted with the emperor. One of the only accounts of the tents used in Rajasthani records comes from Abhay Singh's reign, when an imperial tent housed a gathering of Rajput princes for the signing of the treaty against the Marathas. Abhay Singh's use of the tent would once again animate its duplicate function by projecting the Mughal emperor's sovereign presence at this meeting. That the prerogative to use such a tent was still policed by the Mughals is highlighted by Muhammad Shah's initial disapproval of the tents used by the Rajput princes. It is unlikely that the Rathore Maharaja would have used the tent in battle or during travel, and more likely that the Lal Dera was affixed in Mehrangarh. Indeed, its lack of mobility would prove to be more salient than its motion during the reign of Jodhpur's longest ruling monarch in the 18th century, Vijay Singh. And just to point out, if you remember, Chanchal said, as Chanchal kind of pointed out yesterday, that the halo is very much the prerogative of, the use of the halo is very much within the prerogative of the Mughal the emperor. And so you can see that, even in Jodhpur, there's this attempt to kind of reappropriate in some ways these signs of Mughal kingship. Although his rule was far from stable, Vijay Singh's tenure on the Rathore throne reveals some crucial changes within configurations of Rathore sovereignty and suggests some alternative avenues for engaging with the prized place of the Lal Dera at Mehrangarh from the mid-18th century onwards. Scholars have examined how the fiscal state in Jodhpur underwent critical changes in the 18th century. Without stable backing, the Rathore crown in Jodhpur was increasingly challenged by the rising power of noblemen in Marwar, the same noblemen who had previously served in the Maharaja's military. And this is around a time that you see now noblemen taking on visual conventions that were usually reserved for the emperor, and so they commission scenes of themselves in darbar, basically. Faced with the increasing challenges from his nobles, Vijay Singh's reign witnessed a shift to paid standing armies that would rely on the revenue generated from Jodhpur's local artisans and somewhat warily on merchant capital. And I'm going to focus much more on this emphasis on local craftsmanship because Marwar becomes really prominent as a site as a place for kind of mercantile commerce in the 19th century, and at this time, there's still a kind of hesitant distance with the merchant population in Marwar. What is of note here for our purposes today is that the strength of the Rathore throne, as per this new configuration of sovereignty, depended on the stability of its artisan population in the 18th century. In other words, for the Rathore tilak, or crown, to be taken out of circulation, the same had to be done to Jodhpuri artisans. In order to achieve this, the state had to ensure that war and climate would not succeed in causing artisans to migrate away from Jodhpur, and Marwar is an extremely arid state. As Nandita Prasad Sahai has shown, Vijay Singh's reign would thus set out to secure local trade in Jodhpur by showing its commitment to the welfare of artisans. For example, by creating offices for artisans to lodge complaints and against corrupt officials or merchants, and for them to also complain against unjust taxes.
The Rathore crown also began to back merchant loans and took steps in creating a revenue bureaucracy by standardizing weights, measures, and the currency. And one of the reasons why I became interested in Marwar is because there are certain efforts in creating this kind of fiscal military state that are happening not necessarily in conjunction with what we tend to think of as British military fiscalism. Vijay Singh thus acquired the Mughal emperor's permission to set up his own mint in 1761 and began to strike his own coins in 1780. And after Dana's talk yesterday, I wish I had a picture of a coin, but I do not. Displaying the Rathore Maharaja's name on one side and that of the Mughal emperor on the other, this new currency set out to establish a new terrain of Mughal-backed Rathore sovereignty through its circulation. A second form of circulation would serve to engender ties between the Maharaja and his subjects. Moving away from hierarchical and Brahmanical conceptions of kingship, Vijay Singh joined the Vallabha Samprada sect, a sect devoted to the worship of Krishna, in 1765, and subsequently built 2 Krishna temples through which he would distribute food and offer other charitable services to his subjects. This notion of service was quite central to Vallabha devotional practice, wherein idols of Krishna, especially ones that had been within the presence of the sect's founder Vallabha or his descendants, were treated as potent manifestations of the deity. As such, even painted representations of the deity, such as the one on the right, would show him staring directly at the beholder. And so devotion of the painted object becomes a way of performing devotion to the deity himself. Paintings showing Vijay Singh at worship thus serve to include the ruler within the rituals of Chitra Darshan, that is the mutual gazing of the deity, and Chitra Seva, that is the service of the picture and thus in turn the deity. And thus enabled the circulation of the person of the ruler in a fashion that made him accessible to his subjects. However, in spite of Vijay Singh's patronage, these Krishna idols were always also on the verge of relocation, thanks to other generous or powerful benefactors who were always appearing on the Jodhpuri horizon. And so basically the Vallabha sect becomes a way for a lot of smaller kingdoms to start asserting their sovereignty, but it's often very short-lived because these idols are always moving to other cities where there's either just more political stability or just more mercantile finance even. In conclusion, given the importance of circulation to the fiscal, ritual, and symbolic economy of Jodhpur and the dangers that such circulation simultaneously posed, a Mughal tent taken out of circulation could offer a secure symbol for Rathore sovereignty. As with its original location within the Mughal camp, where the tent had maintained a cautious distance from and proximity to the marketplace, and these avenues here are where the markets would have been, and as you can see, it's very close to the tent itself, the imperial tent. And the marketplace through which the camp sustained itself, the tent's isolation from its twin and its continuing presence at Mehrangarh could instantiate the new links between the crown and the Rathore crown and its subjects that underpinned kingship during the reign of Vijay Singh. In an 1804 painting commemorating the coronation of the Maharaja Man Singh, Vijay Singh's eventual successor, a red imperial tent stands out against the daunting architectural facades in the background. Isolated from its Mughal twin and fixed at Mehrangarh in the crucial eras of Vijay Singh's reign, the Lal Dera had finally become a symbol of the Rathore crown. Thank you. I'll just leave that up.
Thank you very much. We're ready to take questions. Dr. Chowdhury? Okay.
Thank you very much for the talk. It seems that for the most part, there we go. For the most part, it seems like you're talking about this tent in terms of its representation of power. And I was wondering if you could say a few words about maybe instead or in addition, how it actually might have manifested power. And I guess what I'm thinking of is the fact that presumably both the fabrication but also the kind of taking up, putting down, staging of these sorts of things would have required a huge amount of human labor power. So if you could just kind of talk about that a little bit, that would be great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, absolutely. Thank you, Sean. And that's definitely a big part of like the description of these tents in these the different accounts that I mentioned earlier, where they'll talk about it would take almost 1,000 men to erect these tents, and not just manpower or horsepower, but also the mechanical devices that would be mobilized for the erection of these tents. So on the one hand, I mean, this was a big part of it, is that when the Mughal emperor would move, he was moving to places where, there wouldn't be a big palace or fort, but this became a way of communicating the sheer might of the Mughal empire. But I guess what was of interest to me for the purpose of this paper was that, yes, on the one hand, it becomes a way to demonstrate both, the sheer labor and resources that are at the disposal of the Mughal empire, but there was something just really weird about the fact that there were always these two tents. And that, I mean, obviously, on the one hand, this is being done so that the camp is always ready for the Mughal emperor. And when the Mughal emperor traveled in great style, I mean, there would be people that would go ahead of him with shrouds, and if there were dead animals on the road, they would cover them up so that he would be spared the sight of them, or so the accounts go. But at the same time, there was just something very bizarre about the fact that there was this. If the tent was the site at which the emperor is expected to enact his sovereignty, right? So, especially from the reign of Shah Jahan with the Diwan-e-Am and the Cherokee, and Chanchal can probably speak more to this. There's a way in which the spatial organization of Mughal palaces is very much about the animation of the Mughal emperor's power. And the fact that the tents are trying to replicate that in one way, but at the same time there's this duplication that's happening at a time where there is this proliferation of claims on the Mughal throne itself, that just struck me as something to also, I guess, follow through on more.
Question on the other side. Down here, please.
As an architectural historian, I'm clearly more interested in the structure and the design of the actual tent, and I thought the history that you gave was very fascinating of this kind of period of the Mughal court and empire. I'm wondering, in this image that you show right here, it's actually almost contradictory in a way that there's a certain type of permanency versus the ephemeral notion that everybody's been bringing up since yesterday. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about foundations necessary for the tent itself, the actual structure of the columns, for example, the way the panels are set up, and maybe also its extension into other typologies, such as the pavilion, the palace, the courtyard, and other types of interior spaces.
Yeah. Actually, Jenny, thank you for that. So one of the things I should point out is these screens, these reed screens on the right, they were actually added by the curators of the Met. So they're not necessarily part of the original structure. The most of the structure is the original tent, but these screens, which actually block it off from its surroundings, were not. And I think in that way there is this continuity with pavilion architecture, especially like centrally. Yeah, and so there's very much a dialogue with the rest of the camp. And because this would have been the audience hall, the audience tent, there is a sense of, kind of contact with the rest of the camp as well, because where the emperor would go to sleep was very much cut off from the rest of the camp as well. But at the same time, there's almost it's a formidable structure, but there's also an element of illusion to it, because these columns, which seem to be the structural supports, are also basically they're meant to be easily dismantled and wrapped and taken around as well. So there's an element of how can we create these how can we use textile opulently, but how can we also do it in a manner that allows us to move the tent from one place to the next? So, it's trying to kind of have it both ways in terms of creating a certain kind of sturdity, but also in a fashion that would allow the camp to also be in motion at all times.
Napoleon's tents as well, for example, when he brings the tent into the chateau at
Right, and there's very much. One of the reasons I focused on the imperial tent that's used for the encampments is that palaces themselves would also use awnings. So a lot of so they would often be animated during various kind of ritual performances where you would see these awnings being hung out of the different pavilions. So there's a way in which these kind of textiles are being used at the palatial complexes themselves, but at the same time, something like this is trying to also take the place of what these palatial complexes themselves would do.
I see a hand in the back. There, yes. Thank you.
Just right in the middle here. Well, thank you for your talk. It's not a question, it's just a remark, because you know, you cannot avoid thinking of the famous Islamic tent, the mahmal, which is a tent that is carried from, usually at the time of the, let's say, the Mamluk, carried from Cairo to Mecca every year, and it is empty. It is put on a camel, and it will go all the way to Mecca. But the presence of the empty tent is the presence of the Sultan. So, and it struck me again, I mean, it's not only that the tent is expecting now the Mughal emperor to come, it is the invisibility of the emperor which becomes so visible that it's its visibility now. I mean, that's what is happening with the, I think, with the tent here. So it's, the mahmal would be a very nice thing to look at, because it's the same idea of how you make the visibility of the invisible so visible. In this case, it's a nice thing. Just my remark on that.
No, thank you.
Thank you.
A question here in the front.
Thank you so much for your talk, Zirwat. It's really very interesting. When I think about tents, I always think about the late Muammar Gaddafi and his desire to erect his tent in Central Park, which didn't happen, obviously. And of course, it reminds me that whenever you have a tent, you have to have some claim to the land upon which you put that tent. And so tents are essentially related to territorial claims, ownership, and possession. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the ways in which the movement of this tent into this particular space in the fort disengaged notions of territory and the relationship of object to place, in kind of geographically in some ways.
Yeah, I am going to answer that by focusing on the Jodhpur context a little bit more, because going into territorial possession for the Mughal Empire requires a familiarity with taxation that I'm not going to embarrass myself with. But what's interesting is that one of the reasons I think there's this emphasis on fixing this tent in Mehrangarh is that from the mid-18th century onwards, even the Rathore king, even though he's the king of Marwar essentially, only owns 15% of the land in Marwar. So in some ways, you know, keeping the tent from going out into the rest of his territory is very much in response, I think, to the fact that he doesn't own most of his territory. So this assumption, I think this continuity that we often assume between kingship and territorial possession is itself somewhat precarious at this time.
We have time for one more question, and then we'll continue the conversation over coffee.
Hi, Zirwat. Thank you for that wonderful talk, and really learned a lot. But just one of the last paintings you showed of Villaseñor, I think, worshiping Krishna, had the red tent, I think. I'm sure it's intentional on your part to choose that. And I mean, I'm struck by the fact that this red tent in Ladera is so huge, an object, and it sits there in the fort, and its presence must be known like by at least the Rajput that lived there. And I wonder, it's sort of...
By the who?
The Mewar, the Villaseñor, Abhay Singh, and everyone throughout the 18th century, but rarely used until like Man Singh's time. And I wonder that sort of reference there, I wonder if you have found more sort of references to this red tent in like visual forms. I'm just reminded of the pictorial life of the tent, right? And in representations as you're showing us. And it's sort of interesting to think that prime object is like invisible, and it has separate life, as if in the prints that we have looked at of the yesterday, I guess. Wonder if you can actually elaborate a little bit more about the...
I mean, I am still very new to a lot of the visual culture of Marwar in the 18th century, but there aren't too many representations of a red tent. And again, I'm not sure if this tent or the tent for Man Singh is the tent, but I think what's important is the fact that there's this recourse being taken to the representation of an imperial Mughal tent as a way to suggest a certain form of kind of kingship, I guess. But I think that
there is something to be said because there's a lot of textual evidence of where the tent was housed and how it was being used. But I think the fact that it's one of the only Mughal tents that survives to this day. It has such a prized place in the Mehrangarh collections. Attests in some ways to the value of this object as well in Mehrangarh. But again, I just have to think more about how exactly it was being coded within other broader visual representations. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a wonderful paper. Let's have coffee.